welcome for this brown bag lecture of Dr. Akinola Adeoye. Please note that the session will be recorded and it will be uploaded later on the website. Prof.
All right, thank you very much, Samuel. I want to note that we are actually very excited to have this as a first in the series of brown bag seminars for this semester and for this academic year. It's very much a good headline for us to start with, Government's Conflict and Security in Africa, a Convergence. There couldn't be any better time to think about conflict and security, not just in Africa, but also in the world, given the flashpoints in different places. And then also the continuing challenges of security in the continent, and how such conversations, could help build the infrastructure, that would enable us not only to focus as academics, but also to extend our conversations to the public. Dr. Adeoye, I can't thank you enough for being the person who flags off this series for this year, and it's a brand new year, I believe. I do hope that this would also set the tone. I want to thank those who have joined. It's a very tough time for colleagues to join just at the beginning of the year. Thank you for taking out time to be part of this. And then we do hope that it's not going to be a one-off attendance for you. We would like to see you more on this brown bag series for this term. I want to use this opportunity to also thank the moderator and the coordinator, Dr. Samuel Oloruntoba, also the Institute, who has taken on this responsibility in addition to every other responsibilities and the teaching load that he has at the Institute. Thank you, Dr. Oloruntoba, for anchoring this series. I see some of our friends in the house already, and I won't mention them specifically, but they know themselves. And I'd like to thank you all for joining. I look forward to a very robust seminar this afternoon and for the rest of the series. But before I just step aside, I want to acknowledge our eminent and very distinguished administrators at the Institute here, Gabriel and Susa. Very often they play some big role behind the scene coordinating these events, and then the various ways that they help us to stay organized and to be able to anchor the many events that we do at the Institute. Thank you all. And then I'm sorry I may not stay all through. I still have this extended jet lag and I'm not feeling too well, but I will stick around for as much as I can. Thank you. And then welcome to this cycle's brown bag series. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. So just to set the ball rolling, I would like to read a short bio of Dr. Adeoye Akinola. He has a very long CV, but just a short one here. He is the head of research and teaching and head of unit at the African Union Studies at the Institute of Pan-African Thought and Conversation, University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He obtained a doctorate in political science from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and he was previously a lecturer at the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria from 2007 to 2012. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and a visiting professor at the UN mandated University for Peace, UPeace African Regional Program in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. He is the author of several books, including Contemporary Issues on Governance, Conflict and Security in Africa. He specializes in African political economy, African Union Studies, Migration, Peace, and Conflict Studies. So we welcome Dr. Adeoye. I think you have about 30 minutes to talk, or 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it for discussion. Over to you, Dr. Adeoye.
Thank you so much. Please, you will also allow me to thank the organizer of today's event, the leadership of the Institute, Professor Njoka, and you yourself, my beloved brother, Professor Lauren Toba, and Gabriel. I am particularly thankful for the opportunity to be speaking on the convergence of governance, conflicts, and security in Africa. Post-colonial Africa has been categorized as conflict-prone. It has been tagged a death zone and also sometimes categorized as a dark continent. And over the past decades, and despite the moderate achievements of the immediate post-independence African leaders to respond to the yearnings of Africans, the surge of misgovernance across the continent and poverty have become the lot of most of its teeming population. And undoubtedly, its colonial heritage has actually restricted African capacity to ensure the safety, development, and effective governance of its people, thereby generating conflictual interactions between the states, economy, and society, as well as creating a veritable foundation for the proliferation of violent conflicts on the continent. As we have seen over the past years, conflict in Africa is transforming and also conforming into a shape and space that was not the norm in the 2 decades after the Cold War. Contemporary trends of conflict and by extension, violent conflicts have developed to be more complicated over the decades, complex and protracted in nature, thereby involving all kinds of non-state and state actors, even including foreign non-state actors. While there is exhaustive research on conventional security threats in Africa, there has been a dearth of rigorous conversations and even studies on other emerging threats to human security, which have continued to undermine African security, development, and effective governance. Cases of civil wars have reduced in Africa, but other diverse forms of violent conflicts and dissents, including terrorism, xenophobia, youth-led protests like the Nigerian SARS Must Go movement and the South African Fees Must Fall, have endangered the security and lives and property. And it has also threatened the territorial integrity of the concerned states. Regional and economic commissions, which we usually call RECs, such as ECOWAS, and the African Continental Institution, the African Union, have attempted to respond to the myriad of challenges without success. For instance, if you want to look at it, the Agenda 2063, which is a blueprint for peace and development that aimed at fixing Africa by 2063, is struggling after 10 years after its adoption. The security template of Agenda 2063, for instance, is anchored on the Silencing the Gun project or Silencing the Guns initiative. Sadly, across Africa, the guns keep reverberating from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, even through the southern parts of Africa. And among others, the African Union's dependence on foreign powers, particularly the EU and European states, which actually contributed about 70% of the running cost of the African Union in 2021, and the refusal, I use the word refusal, of African political elites to transform the African Union into a supranational organization has become a major reason, or one of the major reasons, for its underperformance. However, as I have also argued elsewhere, Africa could have been in a worse state if not for the establishment and the intervention even of the African Union, as weak as some people will want to regard categorize the African Union. Africa's shifting nature of conflict necessitates fresh conversation, particularly on exploring effective contextual techniques to ensure Africa's peace and security. And furthermore, the changing character of the security landscape reveals a rising gap between practice and classical thoughts on conflict, security, and governance. And even before delving into the reality of the conflict and security landscape in Africa, it is thus important for me to create a convergence or the interlink between governance and security. And I also draw from Paul Collier's paper, Development and Conflict, and his other writings, where he actually establishes a compelling argument revolving around the link between development and conflict. And I usually call him our own Professor Kabile Matlosa, has consistently drawn a relationship between governance, development, and conflict in Africa. And maybe you will permit me to declare that the unresolved structural violence is the most decisive enabler of conflict in Africa. And what do I mean by structural violence? I'm talking about the presence of negative peace and the reinforcement of socio-economic hostility, institutional inequalities, aggressive politicking, and exclusive governance system, which creates the necessary conditions for the outbreak of conflict, particularly violent form of conflict in Africa. In the intricate tapestry of Africa's socio-political landscape, the interplay between governance and security emerges as a crucial determinant of Africa's stability and progress. And the governance architecture on the continent intricately woven into the fabric of statecraft, and it serves as the cornerstone upon which the edifice of security on the continent is erected. Effective governance, marked by transparency, accountability, and inclusive institutions, stand as the vanguard against the perils that threaten the continent's tranquility. Within the complexity of Africa's diverse geopolitical terrains, adept governance orchestrates a symphony of policy that transcends the mere exercise of authority, maybe it be political, social, cultural, traditional, or even economic. It becomes a harmonious arrangement that nurtures societal cohesion, and the absence of robust and effective governance, conversely, renders Africa susceptible to the erosive forces of conflict, extremism, religious terrorism, and social unrest, thereby compromising the very bedrock of security. Yet, many challenges persist, manifesting in governance deficits, including low human capacity building, high rates of unemployment, and lack of basic infrastructures like dilapidated health facilities, dilapidated education system, which give rise to vulnerabilities across the continent. Corrupt practices, undemocratic governance structures, and institutional fragility expose Africa to the forces of insecurity. Hence, addressing the link between governance and security demands a comprehensive commitment to fostering accountable leadership, upholding the rule of law, and nurturing institutions that resonate with the aspirations of Africa's diverse population, from the west to the north, through the south, and even to the east. In this intricate ballet between governance and security, Africa navigates the delicate choreography that determines its destiny. And what is this destiny? A destiny intricately interwoven with the fabric of effective and visionary governance, safeguarding the continent against the tempestuous winds of insecurity and violent conflict. In Africa, the regional economic commissions, the African Union and Africa political elites must now, as I'm speaking to you, keep their eyes on the Horn and East Africa, where the unresolved Somaliland sovereignty question and the evolving diplomatic crisis between Ethiopia and Eritrea in one hand, and between Ethiopia and Somalia, have the potency to degenerate into the eruption of interstate violent conflicts. We can also look beyond Ethiopia and look at East Africa, where Rwanda just accused Burundi of instigating a youth revolt against the Rwanda president, Paul Kagame, while Congo DRC President Tshisekedi promised to declare war on Rwanda if he were to be re-elected because of the alleged Rwanda interference in Congo and Kagame's alleged support for the M23 violent group operating in the DRC. And either fortunately or unfortunately, Tshisekedi has just won the election, and the question on the lips of many people that have followed the hostility between Rwanda and Congo DRC will be asking is, will he go ahead and declare war on Rwanda? So Africa may soon witness not just intrastate conflict, not just insurgency, not just terrorism, but full-blown interstate war. Prudent stewards of the African peace and security initiative must also remain cognizant of the looming menace posed by foreign fighters and mercenaries across Africa, which imperil both the stability of the African continent and the judicious utilization of its invaluable mineral resources. And notably, entities like the Russian-sponsored Wagner Group conspicuously assert their influence in the Sahelian nations of Mali and Chad and even other countries, even at a point in time, including Mozambique, indicating a burgeoning phenomenon characterized by an unbridled pursuit of Africa's mineral wealth and the perilous, what I call the unregulated commodification or commercialization of its security domain. And evidently, either we like it or not, the involved state where the machineries are operating or have operated have found themselves gradually relinquishing the hitherto sacrosanct mantle of security sovereignty as they become entangled with groups of shadowy and unaccountable security and military forces. Governance failures, unconstitutional tenure elongations, and foreign interference across the Sahel in particular have accounted for the resurgence of military coups in the last 4 years. If we want to look at Mo Ibrahim Governance Index for 2022, it holds that African governments are less accountable and transparent in 2021 than at any other time since 2020. That's over 10 years period. And since 2020, 7 African countries, including Gabon, Niger, Burkina Faso, Sudan, Guinea, Chad, and Mali, have experienced not just military coup attempts, but successful military coups. And this has actually heightened insecurity and worsened the economic conditions of citizens in this country. If I may be permitted to make this assertive statement, Africa has become or is the most wasteful continent in the world. And how is Africa wasteful? Apart from its well-documented mineral resource wealth, the continent possesses an enviable. I can say that currently, Africa is host to the youngest population in the world, with about 400 million young people aged between 15 and 30 years. And also, children under the age of 25 made up 60% of the African total population in 2020. Despite this, yet African political elites, they keep resisting this phenomenon we call youthquake. And I also know that in a particular country, even without mentioning the country, the Minister of Youth was more than 70 years old. Also, the political leaders have failed to utilize this very resourceful capital. And I'm talking about the availability of young and vibrant youth on the continent. And because they have not tapped these human resources, it has opened the space for their mobilization for conflict and terrorism by those people I categorize as warmongers on the continent. Please also permit me to present some statistical evidence of the struggle of the African child in Africa. And I will first by just speaking about data that are related to bad governance performance. In Africa, the inflation rate on the continent 20 years ago, in 2003, was 9.1%. Fast forward to 10 years after, in 2013, it became 6.5%. It reduced. But in 2023, it almost doubled the figure of 2013, and it has become 15.7%. And this keep rising. The unemployment rate in 2013 was 6.47%, and this has risen to 7.11% in 2023, just last year. 44 out of 49 countries in Africa scored below 50 in the Corruption Perception Index, even for last year. Conflict and corruption, including political stability, have further weakened the institutional capacity of countries in Africa to engage in anti-corruption programs, while other countries are not even keen, enthusiastic, or willing to engage in anti-corruption programs because of the political corruption endemic in the society. In 2022, the worst flooding in several years damaged or destroyed 38,000 homes in Niger. While this is attributed to climate change, the occurrence was also characterized by poor governmental preparedness and response to climate change. I can also speak to data related to the casualties of conflict and or misgovernance on the continent. And last year, talking about 2023, UNICEF revealed that 10 million children in just 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are in serious need of humanitarian assistance because of violent conflicts. A report also by the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, reveals that the war in Ethiopia's Tigray region accounted for an estimated 100,000 battle-related deaths in 2022. That was even more than Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which at the time accounted for over 81,000 deaths, according to new conflict trends data released in the middle of 2023. Other reports also estimated that about 1.5 million people have been displaced in Ethiopia and Tigray region. Since 1996, the violent conflict in the DRC Congo has over 6 million people tagged or recorded or documented as dead. The conflict has been declared as the worst, bloodiest conflict since World War II. And if we will go further, between 2020 and 2021, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project reports that about 15,000 people died due to conflict in the Sahel region. In 2007, Kenyan electoral violence claimed the life of more than 1,000 people. And also based on a report by the Missing Migrants Project, since 2014, almost 10 years ago, the Central Mediterranean Sea Route, primarily used by Africans attempting to cross into Europe irregularly, witnessed the highest number of dead or missing persons estimated at 22,746 individuals. Of course, we can speak about figures, but like I usually say, these figures can be matched with faces. They have identities, they have dreams, they have expectations, but unfortunately, those were the numbers that perish in the Mediterranean Sea. Extreme nationalism, aggressive economic protectionism, anti-migration policies, and xenophobia, what some people will regard as Afrophobia, and other push factors, including climate change and autocracy, have driven more irregular migrants to use those unsafe, irregular routes to cross to Europe, either through the dangerous Mediterranean Sea or through the Sahara Desert. So I can't speak on and on, but the question is, how do we proceed from here? Am I absolutely pessimistic that Africa would not be able to ensure peace, security, and effective governance on the continent? The first thing I will say is this. I think, well, maybe it is instructively pertinent to rethink the liberal or the neoliberal development and peace paradigm in Africa. Extreme adherence to what I call the manipulative capitalism and the detached democracy, and I use the word detached because the people have been exceedingly detached from the states under the so-called representative democracy. These systems are antithetical to African survival. Liberalism has generated severe contradictions in Africa. Therefore, can't we talk about a need to domesticate Western democratic templates and align them to the African reality? We can also begin to make an assertive statement to say that the tenets of the liberal peace theory have failed in Africa. Notions on consensus, on negotiations, and resilience of institutional capacity to manage disagreement and avoid violent conflict do not apply to Africa under the current neoliberal framework. What of the liberal peace architecture? And my reading about this, and as other people have also written, is that it is exceedingly punitive. It is too state-centric and not amenable to Africa's peculiar socio-organic formation. And somebody may ask, so why not explore indigenous conflict resolution strategies, such as Ubuntu, for instance? What we know about Ubuntu and similar philosophy in Africa, which we can call traditional indigenous, is the notion of I am because you are. And what does it reinforce? It reinforces community solidarity over individual sovereignty. And we know that the bedrock of both capitalism and liberal democracy is founded on individual sovereignty, individual liberty. While many may argue that Ubuntu may not be compatible with the African modern system, so the question is, if it is not that compatible, why not modernize it? Why not develop it? Or we can also talk about the dwindling influence and commitment of regional powers in Africa to continental peace or even sub-regional peace. And we can speak about Nigeria, for instance, and we can speak about South Africa. And because of their detachment or non-commitment to continental peace and security, it has opened a security gap on the continent. And the result are this consistent growing proliferation of military coups and mercenaries on the continent. Nigeria has been less active in securing West Africa. That's a fact in the last years. South Africa has also continued its quiet diplomacy and is less responsible for conflict in Southern Africa. While Nigeria, for instance, is seriously grappling with its own domestic, economic, and security challenges, including the protracted battle against religious terrorism and resource militancy, South Africa, which has its own socio-economic challenges, is more committed to the global system I know that twice the leadership has led peace initiative to Ukraine, to Russia. Now they are in the ICC court trying to. We're not actually taking Israel to court. And we have many conflicts in Africa. One would have imagined that somebody, well, maybe a political actor, not even from South Africa, would have led several peace missions to countries like Sudan, where two generals are tearing the country apart. The peace, development, and security of Africa is linked to the commitments of African major powers, not just South Africa and Nigeria. We talk about Egypt and relatively Kenya, and their commitment to the Pan-African peace and security agendas is exceedingly important. We can also speak about the extreme dependence of African elites, African leaders, even regional actors on foreign assistance for ensuring peace and security in Africa. This is exceedingly counterproductive. What happened to the once celebrated idea of seeking African solutions to African problems? African solutions to African problems speaks to ownership. And what I mean by ownership is that Africans should be able to take the lead in providing sustainable solutions to its conflict and insecurity. Foreign powers can support, but they should not lead because they do not understand the dynamism of conflict in Africa. And personally, I fear for the security of the Sahel region, not because of the exit of France and the dwindling influence of the West, but the scramble for the region by other emerging powers, such as Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and even China, whose interests are not so different from the West. What are their interests? Is both economic and the extraction of Africa's mineral resources. So those emerging powers are actually willing and ready and aggressively pushing to occupy the space left by the West, particularly France, in Sahelian countries like Mali, for instance. Can African leaders begin to turn to their diaspora community for assistance, particularly in the sharing and generation of knowledge and innovation, which many people will call brain gain? Instead of celebrating, talk about the death of brain, I think it is important to actually celebrate and explore the opportunities and prospects of brain gain on the continent. Can the political elite, I use the word, maybe pass a motive word like humble, can they be humble enough to create space for the civil society organization to operate without necessarily seeing the CSOs as oppositions, thereby excluding them from governance? Is continental regionalism the way out of Africa's socio-economic and political and even governance problem? And the main question that many of us may want to ask is that what is wrong with Africa? Is it only the economic or political system that are Western, or should we begin to focus more on the operators of the system, perhaps? And I think we have seen it across Africa, particularly in the both disposition of African elites to be exceedingly corrupt and exceedingly autocratic. So maybe it's not just the system, but even the operator of the system that we have to focus on. So let me submit by saying that the state that should be a problem solver has become the problem to be solved. Therefore, effective governance, sustainable peace and security, and consistent development of Africa depend on the transformation of the minds of its political elites and the vibrancy of its civil society actors. Mr. Moderator, I think you will permit me to stop at this point. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Adeoye, you've given us so much to chew. very comprehensive, very elaborate, very articulate, I would say. And this has given us so much to reflect on. Just before I invite people to maybe ask their questions and make their comment, I would like to maybe use my privilege as a chair to stimulate your thought about something that I think is missing, maybe I didn't pick it, about the non-state actors that are challenging the legitimacy of the state in Africa. Talk about Boko Haram, talk about ISIS, talk about bandits, so-called bandits in Nigeria, for instance, and how that undermine the capacity of the state to effectively govern the spaces. And there are so many ungoverned spaces as well in Africa that the state is more or less absent, as it were, today. And secondly, to talk about how the failure of the orthodox security architecture can be replaced or maybe complemented by traditional institutions, governance institutions. We know that the majority of the people on the continent still live in rural areas. And what is the role of traditional institutions in mediating the space that the state has more or less left? So you have that as something to think about while we invite people to ask questions. So the floor is open. If you have questions, can you please raise your hand through the link below so that I can recognize you and call you. So you can, through the reaction button. Comments or questions to our esteemed speaker here. Am I seeing somebody? Okay. Maybe you want to start by responding to the issues that I raised first, and then maybe people are still gathering their thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair or the Program Director. Let me take the first question, talking about terrorism. Well, at least many people prefer to regard them as religious terrorism.
Sorry, I see Professor, I've seen like 3 hands actually. Professor Cathy Cole, Dr. Wumi Dada, and Dr. Jumo Ayodele. So let's listen first to them. I don't want to abuse my privilege. Professor Cathy Cole, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. I was in the latest reports about Sudan, as well as about Ethiopia and Somaliland. It feels as if there's a new prominent actor of the UAE, and I'm just wondering kind of what the history is of its involvement in these conflicts and why it's becoming involved, and just kind of what its historical relationship is with those states. If you have any insight into that, that would be wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, so the second person will ask the question, the third will ask, then you respond for that first.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive and interesting talk. I was thinking about what you mentioned around the Ubuntu philosophy. I guess you propose it as one of the possible ways that we could think through creating peace, sustainable peace on the African continent. And while as a person, I feel that there's something probably even a bit hegemonic about how we push the Ubuntu philosophy to the exclusion of others, but be that as it may, how do you foresee the operationalization of Ubuntu? Is it within the justice systems that we have in Africa? What would it look like if we were to actually operationalize, as you suggested, the Ubuntu philosophy towards achieving peace? And maybe there are other, and maybe this is like a part B of the questions, are there other indigenous ideologies or thoughts that are more known in these conflict areas, say, for instance, in northeastern Nigeria, or in DRC, that are more relatable, that, could be explored by the people without necessarily formalizing the peace architecture? Because I do believe that one of the challenges is that we try to institutionalize or formalize these peace architectures or peace strategies. And that is holding us back because, as we know, the institutions in Africa, appears to be weak. So it links to Professor Lontoba's question about, traditional means. How do we reintroduce indigenous and traditional means of achieving peace? And is there a kind of peace that we can have that is not, peace as defined by the United Nations structures, that is more African to us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jumo Ayodele, sorry.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. And my comments and my questions are building off what my esteemed colleagues have said. You really pointed out that, a lot of times we promote this mantra of African solutions to African problems, but it doesn't necessarily seem like we are at the forefront of addressing a lot of our security and governance issues. I do wonder if there is, and whether we should be thinking about the concept of African legitimacy, because it seems like there's a disconnect with how we on the ground view legitimacy if you talk to regular African citizens, and how we are trained as, political science majors or IR majors, and how we think about legitimacy within the global order. So I'm wondering, in your own opinion, if you can define or how we should be thinking about African legitimacy, especially within the context of governance and security and peace. Is there African legitimacy? That's the question. And if so, what does it look like? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Great questions. So the speaker, please respond. You can respond now.
Thank you. I know when you are presenting to sound minds, then you have to be ready to accommodate such intelligent and thought-provoking questions. Let me start with the audience, then I can come back to you maybe towards the end. I will start with Professor Cathy Cole. I hope I got it right. And she was talking about Sudan and Ethiopia and the interference or the intervention of, in quotes, new players coming into this space. And I think I touched a little bit on this gap that has been created, one, because of the inability of the West and even the United Nations peace and security architecture to effectively respond to the issues of peace and security in Africa. And I will say this, for instance, in the Sahel, maybe I can use Mali for example, or even other Sahelian countries, despite the fact of stationing more than 5,000 French forces in Mali, insecurity persisted, and there was military coup under their noses, and they couldn't ever stop it. Every week, every day, there were militias attacking, killing civilians. So the question is, what are or even the UN forces, what are they doing in such spaces? We can even speak to the Horn of Africa. For instance, Somalia, where we have not just UN people, we have African-led peace forces in Somalia. And despite that, every day, every time you see attacks from Al-Shabaab. So there's a tendency for some set of political elite to begin to think beyond the West. And like I said, there is a relative hostility against the West in certain countries in Africa, and some people will say legitimately so. And a country like UAE, not only UAE, even Saudi Arabia in Sudan, Saudi Arabia led the peace initiative. And you are wondering, where was the African Union? Where was the IGAD, the Intergovernmental, I've forgotten now, IGAD. Yes, thank you, Mr. Authority. Well, where are they? Where are the political elites in Africa? So the non-Western country are seizing the opportunity to intervene. And now India is even coming into the space. Even Turkey is coming into the space. So Africa is just open. And like I said, the interest of all of the, of course, in case of Saudi Arabia with Sudan, maybe people can talk about maybe religious connection and all, because they have the same sheer history of religions and all of that. But what about Ethiopia? So African is just open up. That's the point I'm making. Their interest is the same thing. It's economy, it's resources. It's not as if they love the Sudan so much or they love Ethiopia so much. They just want to seize the opportunity and find a way also to transfer resources and negotiate with some of these countries. And if I can come to Professor Wumi, she was talking about Ubuntu, and it seems as if Ubuntu has become exceedingly hegemonic. And yes, I think I can also reinforce that. And why are we going to say that? Because that's relatively the only indigenous system that many academics, not too many, but few academics are pushing into the forefront. That's number one. Then because it was also practicalized, particularly immediately after the end of apartheid in South Africa, where Desmond Tutu led the TRC Commission, and the whole world knew that they said what we were going to use was to apply the principle of Ubuntu. The whole difference between this and the liberal architecture is that in terms of Ubuntu, it's not punitive. It's not to ascertain blame. It's not to throw somebody in the prison. And I also know, apart from Ubuntu, there are other indigenous principles. We can call it principle across African states. People can talk about maybe Ujamaa. And even in Rwanda, remember, after the genocide, they did not implement peace processing through the liberal route. And what they did was closer to Ubuntu. But the important thing about what I call the traditional system is because it recognizes the fact that the society is more sacrosanct than the individual. So it promotes community solidarity above individual, which is contrary to what the liberal peace architecture will promote. So it's not as if Ubuntu is exceedingly hegemonic. Across Africa, they have different versions that speak to the same thing, but because we all know Ubuntu, and maybe because I'm biased because I am in South Africa, so I tend to speak more about Ubuntu. Now, I can also speak a little bit about what maybe Professor Ayodele have spoken about this concept of African legitimacy. And the question is, we can talk about African legitimacy, or we can speak about liberal legitimacy in Africa. Those are two different conceptions. And I'm saying that, and I will link it also to the traditional system. I once asked somebody, and I'm saying it again as an example, if you were to put by your right the president of this country, I am just using it as an example, it's applicable to all African states. If you were to put the president of this country in, maybe in my right, and you put the traditional leader of your society, of your community by the left. In the case of South Africa, particularly the Zulu people, we talk about the Zulu king, and you put the president by the right, and you call a Zulu person, a native person, and you give him a knife or a stone, and you say, throw it at someone. I can't bet, but I'm sure they would likely throw it at the president because they feel more connected to the traditional leadership. They feel more connected to the people without actually voting for them. So what we know as legitimacy is just majority rule. And we also know in Africa, because once you say you are legitimate, that means you have come into power through what they tag as majority votes. But we know majority votes in Africa doesn't mean anything. Votes are manufactured. Many people are also voting without understanding why they are voting for certain candidate because of the lack of education. And I will still use South Africa as an example. In South Africa, many people that are still voting for the African National Congress, the ANC in their imagination are still voting for Mandela. And Mandela died many years ago because they do not understand the worth of their vote. So African as it is under this current system cannot even speak about legitimacy because almost, and I'm saying it with almost all the leaders in Africa are illegitimate. It doesn't matter if they have claimed to have won the election. We just saw election in Congo DRC. We have seen election in Nigeria where people have complained about irregularities, but the West will categorize those leaders as legitimate. But to the people, we know that many of them are illegitimate. Maybe I should pause. I will still come back to
Thank you very much. Thanks for the responses. Great responses there. Do we have more questions? More questions relating to governance, conflict, and security in Africa? Or maybe some interjections or some,
There is one, Rebecca.
Rebecca, I'm not seeing it. Okay, Rebecca, please. Thank you, Gabriel. Please go ahead with your question, Professor Dr. Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this input. I heard you say at the end that, I guess the strategic focus needs to be on shifting power from the current elite to focusing on what civil society can do. And I'd love to ask you to say more about what you think civil society can be doing, or what the specific strategies are for civil society when talking about governance and addressing conflict.
Great question. Do we have any other person who want to weigh in? Ask Gabriel, did you see any other person there?
There is Itumeleng Selialia.
Thank you, Itumeleng. Please go ahead. Professor Itumeleng. Can you unmute? Hello? Okay, maybe is he still there? All right, maybe the speaker, can you please respond to Rebecca's question? Let's hope Itumeleng will ask her question later. I can't see her name here.
Thank you, the program director.
Oh, she's trying to.
One may want. Sorry?
Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Over the years, not just now, there maybe this consistent advocacy or agitation about the expansion of this space given to the civil society to operate in Africa. And we have to face the facts. And the first thing is just that civil society in Africa are too weak. They are not weak by their own design. They are weak because of also the nature and the character of the political elite that we have in Africa. Because they have seen the civil society as the opposition party, the unannounced opposition party, not just the voice of the people. They don't relate to them as the voice of the people, but they have seen them as a group of people that are usually countering the government and constituting opposition out of power. So what they tend to do most of the time is to also deny them of the required funding. So what will the civil society do? They turn to maybe Europe, they turn to the US, and they seek funding to actually execute some of their projects. But you know, when you also get funding from some of those donor organizations or donors actor, you've got to utilize the funding based on their own templates. And most of the time, they even tell you what to implement. So there is that problem with African civil society. And secondly, apart from that, apart from the question that maybe they are exceedingly disconnected from the government, not just the government. Even when we speak about even the academics, there's still a slight disconnection between the academics and the civil society. Conventionally, one would have thought that the academics are also part of the civil society, but in these kinds of environment, they are detached. So whatever the civil society actor, most of the times are activated. Many times they write policy brief. Sometimes they have brilliant suggestions, but it doesn't get to the table of the political elite. That's number one. And if it gets to the table of the political elite, many of the political leaders in Africa are not used to relying on whatever the civil society are proposing for their own policy initiation or policy execution. They rely on their patronage system, maybe their girlfriends, their family members, the minister who occupy the office, not based on their credentials, but through meritocracy. So that's the problem in Africa. So we can begin to talk about replacing the political elite, allowing the civil society actors to come into the space, but it will just end at the level of rhetoric and advocacy. It's not something we have seen happening in Africa. And maybe I can use the opportunity to come back to some of the questions Professor Lorna initially asked. Oh, okay, yes. Sorry, I'm trying to look for. Oh, okay, yes. It was talking about the terrorist organizations, the banditry in some of these countries, headers, farmers conflict, particularly in Nigeria, and even in Mali, which has also been transferred some aspects to some parts in Cameroon. And the real question is just that how does this affect state capacity differently and in different ways? The first thing we have to also be conscious about is the financial cost of counterterrorism, for instance. And if one would look at a country like Nigeria, as in millions of dollars are being spent to counter terrorism, to actually counter oil militancy in the Niger Delta area of the country. And it's not only in Nigeria. If you go to Mozambique, in the Sebagado region, the resource region of Mozambique, is the same thing, because the government are spending so much to curtail the insurgency, and some of this funding could have been used to provide services for the people, to improve the education system, for instance, or the health facility of the country. Although some people will also argue that even if this funding were not to have been used to counter terrorism or banditry, that the political elite would have swallowed the money up through their network of correction. But there's an effect. One will also see that even the security system itself cannot be that strong when you have conflicts all hitting from different areas. For instance, even in Mali, every time as the government will be trying to curtail some conflict in the northern parts of Mali, then you see conflict bring up in the other parts. So it creates this instability even within the government circles. And one of the reasons, particularly in Mali, not only in Mali, even in Niger, one of the reasons the military, I call them the military boys that forcefully removed the legitimate, in quotes, the legitimate government gave, was that the government has failed to curtail the expansionist strategies of some of these violent organizations like banditry. But apart from that, when there's conflict, it is exceedingly difficult to implement developmental agenda. It is exceedingly not just for the government alone, even for the non-governmental actors, maybe donor organization, development institution from Europe. How do you go to a conflict zone to implement developmental program? Apart from that, Africans, most of the countries in Africa, most of the people in those countries relies on what? On farming. How can you farm when there's conflict? Most of the farmers have been driven away from their farms. Many farms have been destroyed. The livelihood of, so we can't just quantify the cost of some of these instability, some of these, sometimes not just only instability, but criminality in some parts of Africa where conflict breeds. You also mentioned the failure of the Orthodox peace architecture, talking about the traditional institution. Is there a space left for the traditional institutions? Well, it depends on, because sometimes also we might make the mistake of universalizing Africa as a single entity. So this depends on the society we are talking about. In some African society, the traditional system have been so politicized that there's no difference between the political system that we are condemning as liberal and even the traditional leadership, because it's as if they are the same. Many of them are receiving salaries from the government, so they hardly criticize the government because they are on government's payroll. But we still have some society whereby the traditional authority could still be integrated into the peace and security system, because somehow the traditional political elite has some legitimacy and they have a way of maintaining peace in their domain. And maybe this can be transferred to another level, talk of state level. I know, for instance, there are some African society whereby they have the Council of Traditional Rulers, which are advisory and they advise the government. So, of course, we can merge the two. I'm not actually advocating for the complete rejection of liberalism. I'm just saying there must be an adaptation. Why not weave it around, introduce some element of traditional system compatible to our reality, and accept whatever Western system that is also compatible to African quest to develop and to achieve peace. Thank you, moderator.
Very much. I think Itumeleng is back. Maybe she will still have an opportunity to ask a question. Itumeleng, are you there? Can you unmute? Yeah. Can you unmute yourself? Itumeleng, are you hearing me? Okay, well, we cannot hear Itumeleng. Thank you so much, the guest speaker, Dr. Akinola Adeoye, for stimulating our thought on this very important topic. There are no clear answers, but I think you've given us some food for thought, and we'll continue to think and hope that Africa will get its act right, because my point has always been that without security, all the great development agenda, the African continental free trade, all of them, they would just be in the realm of aspiration without, clear-cut security arrangement to manage all these various centripetal and centrifugal forces across the continent. Thank you so much, and a round of applause for him. Virtual round of applause. We hope to call on you again to join you. Thank you so much, and enjoy your evening in South Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
And thanks to our great audience for honoring our invitation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.